Hey everyone, welcome to Arc Studio Presents. I'm Micah Cratty. I'm a WJ screenwriter and the head of writing at Arc Studio. I'm so excited that you're here today. We're gonna have a great show. If you're interested in Arc Studio, please check it out below. It's, I think, the best screenwriting software. It's what I use. You can learn more at arcstudiopro.com, and there is a link in the description. I want to know where everyone is tonight. Are you excited to be here? I love having people from all around the world. Let me know how you're doing, where you're watching from. Get in the chat. In just a moment, I'm going to bring on Jill Chamberlain, a screenwriter, a script consultant, and the author and creator of the Nutshell Technique, Cracking the Secret of Successful Screenwriting. And we're going to go deep into what the Nutshell Technique is and maybe what it can do for you as a writer. I'm a little familiar with it. I'm not an expert on the Nutshell Technique. I have some knowledge of it, but not a lot. So I'm actually excited to learn more myself about it and kind of be a student along with you guys as Jill kind of walks us through this. Yeah, feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'll try to work in some as we go along when they're relevant. But I'll also be talking to her. But yeah, put the questions in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. And if we have some time at the end, maybe we can go through and do some of the questions that we missed. Please like this video if you feel like it, and maybe you can make that decision later. You know, I'm not going to pressure you up front. Subscribe, turn on notifications if you want to know about our future events. Speaking of which, one quick announcement before I bring on Jill. If you're a screenwriter looking for a community, a supportive community of fellow writers and kind of some accountability, and you want to carve some time out for your writing, then join me every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific for Let's Write Scripts. It's a live stream screenwriting show on the Arc Studio channel. And it's great. We do 3 timed writing sprints. I answer screenwriting questions. During the breaks, I show pictures of sandwiches because I love them and they're beautiful, and it's just like a lot of fun. So you can RSVP for that at arcstudiopro.com/events. And there's also a link to that in the description. So, all right, that's it for announcements. I think we're going to get to the meat of it, the real stuff that we're here to learn about. So please, without further ado, welcome to the virtual stage, Jill Chamberlain. Jill, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. It's my pleasure to be here. Very excited.
I'm excited to have you. Everyone else is excited here. There's just like lots of energy coursing through the internet. I can tell already. So we're going to talk about the Nutshell Technique. The Nutshell Technique, as it says beneath your name, right there on the screen. This is your technique. You came up with it. You wrote a book about it. And we're going to get into the details of it. We'll kind of walk through some examples of it. Talk about how writers can use it. But to start with, kind of just like in a nutshell, what is the Nutshell Technique and what does it offer screenwriters?
Yeah, it's a method I created because of chronic work I was seeing in my work as a script consultant. You know, people bring me a script that's perfectly formatted and industry standard, and it might have sparkling dialogue and interesting characters and some interesting plot points. But I was finding that invariably writers were failing to tell a story. Like 99%, particularly of first-time writers, but plenty of my professional screenwriters do that as well. What the 99% do instead, I would describe as, instead of telling a story, they're presenting a situation. Life is a situation. Life is this happens, then this happens, then this happens. That is not a story, right? A story is this happens, which makes it ironic when this next thing happens, and brings us further into it when this third thing happens. There's a connection between the parts. And none of the methods that I was aware of were dealing with that. They tend to present a linear beat sheet method, that kind of thing. And the problem where the problem comes from is not from the linear part of the structure. It's the glue that needs to hold it together. So my method kind of merges a linear approach along with character development. They're not two separate things. They're, in fact, character development is very linked to structure. It should be. And if you miss those connections, you end up in that 99% of people who are failing to tell a story.
You know, I think that's interesting. It's always funny whenever you start talking about one aspect of screenwriting, you invariably talk about other aspects because, like you said, they are linked. Like structure is character. They're all one thing, and you can't really take them apart separately. You mentioned, all right, the situation thing, which is I totally feel you on. I always think of it as like a grocery list, kind of. It's just like you're just listing things versus having a story. And having that connective tissue, like for me, I always think of but and therefore this happens, but this happens, therefore
Right.
this third thing happens, and now you're starting to tell a story versus just listing things. But I'm curious into how do you define story? I feel like it's one of those things that intuitively we know what it is. We tell stories to people from very young. What do you see as a story or as the essential parts of telling a story?
Well, I'm going to crib from Aristotle here, because that's how I break down story, right? Is that according to Aristotle, I break stories into comedies and tragedies. And when I'm talking about comedy, I'm not talking about a ha-ha comedy. I'm talking about Aristotelian comedy. His definition of a story is where we have a protagonist who has a flaw, and in the end, either they overcome it, they change, and we get a happy ending. That's a comedy. Or they fail to overcome it. They fail to learn, and in the end, they have a sad ending. So that's the most basic version. And yes, there are other elements, but that protagonist, the hero, is going to be the backbone of the story that we need for it to feel satisfying. You know, there are some stories that don't follow that pattern. I'm kind of jumping ahead to something a little advanced. I call the secret protagonist. You know, basically we need one character to follow this pattern or this pattern. And that might not be, you know, the quote unquote main character. Sometimes sometimes we have stories about bad things happening to good people and there is no redemption for them in the end. And we have stories about bad people who get away with things and there's no redemption for them in the end. We need a secret protagonist then to see their story through that lens, because without that, we don't relate to it. It's distancing and it feels situational.
When you talk about story, it feels very robust, like story with a capital S. Like, you know, things get better before they get worse, or they get worse before they get better. Is that something that's unique to literature in the sense of like film and books, or do you think that's just kind of like stories in general, even just kind of like casual stories? Is that something of a different nature?
I mean, to a degree, you know, my method can be used for screenplays, for television, for novels. You know, anytime you want to ensure you're not just presenting a situation. I hesitate to say any kind of story. You know, the story your Aunt Edna tells, you know, probably is missing some of those elements, but that's probably why it's not an interesting story, right? That it's not compelling. We're like, what was the story? I lost you somewhere there. Right. So with those elements, we're accomplishing, if you get all those elements in, it's accomplishing a lot more. There are a lot of really important principles that are involved versus it being I'll call it a tale, would be maybe something that doesn't have those inherent things that mesh the character development along with the plot development.
Gotcha. So this is a technique, not a formula, but I feel like a lot of times screenwriters are resistant to, let's say, approaches or techniques because they feel like they're a formula and they're worried about being stifled, about being limited, not having the creativity. How does that work in the nutshell technique? How do you kind of maintain creativity and freedom in your storytelling?
So yeah, it's a structure, not formula. You know, like she did. Like, I think it's helpful to define structure. I'm going to do it with a story. I was at a party once, and I ran into a student of mine who introduced me to a well-known documentary filmmaker who I'm not going to name, and she introduced me as her screenwriting teacher who wrote a book on structure. And his attitude to me was a little bit like structure, smucture, you know. And so I said, well, that's interesting. Tell me, with your documentary films, do you just stick a camera on one person for 90 minutes without cutting away or using, B-roll or anything? Is that what you do? He said, no, of course not. We employ editing, we use B-roll, all those things. And I said, well, if you're employing editing and B-roll, you're employing structure. That's all structure is. What are the events you choose to show, and what is the order you choose to show them in? That is all it means. And so With my structure, what I'm doing is I'm ensuring that you're not going to end up with a situation, not a story. I'm going to make sure that your character is, as a result of using this, your character is not just a victim. There's a reason why this character is on this journey. It answers the question, very common questions writer get of why now? Why is this happening now? It shows you how to make sure you have an ending that's surprising and also satisfying, right? All of those principles are inherent in this structure. So there are other structures, but this structure ensures those particular things, and that I feel define a story. Without those couple of elements I mentioned, we're back to a situation. We're back to life.
Gotcha. Before we jump into it more, as a point of comparison, because I feel like some people might be familiar with like Save the Cat or the hero's journey or some other approaches. How does the nutshell technique, is it similar to those? Is it trying to do something different than those other approaches? How would you sort of see them in relation to the kind of other approaches?
The biggest difference is those are purely linear structures, right? They're purely linear. You have to hit 15 or 22 or however many, depending on what method we're talking about, how many beats that are, essentially in every Hollywood movie. Well, you can hit all those beats and end up with a situation, not a story, because it's not talking about the link between them. And so my method, I have some elements in linear time. I have, 4 to 5 elements. You have to have a first scene. You have to have a last scene. There's something that happens at 25%. There's something that happens at 75%, right? That's my linear structure. The rest of it isn't linear. The rest of it is how are those 4 things related? And they are related in very specific ways to the protagonist journey. So that's the difference. There are a number of people who use my method in conjunction with, one of those other methods. They don't contradict each other. They're just a different way to look at it.
Gotcha. So in terms of like what it is and what it isn't, is it concerned with the scene level, like action lines and dialogue and that level of writing, or is it purely a structure and character?
It's a big, I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, but yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's a big picture approach.
Gotcha.
It is helping you understand what your story is at a bird's eye level. We're really kind of looking at and very often people don't know what their story's about, right? And this is helping them figure it out, often without even having written a word, because we can see the whole thing on one piece of paper. We can see what's working, what's not working, and how to make those adjustments very easily. So yeah, it's a big picture. Let's make sure we're presenting a story, not
awesome.
Not just
fantastic. All right, so we're gonna jump into example really quick, but I just want to check in with the chat. Say hey, we got people joining us from Australia, from Canada, Nashville, Massachusetts. People are Kim's excited about this. People are excited to learn as much as they can. So also, people notice I have an axe on the wall behind me. I like Christian. It's there to axe stuff that isn't working in the scripts. Yeah, whenever you need to kill your darlings, it's good to have an axe available here. All right, great. So we are going to now, from what I know, you use very specific terms in kind of your approach, and the easiest way to sort of learn what those terms are, to define them, is to see them in action. So we're going to use the example of an existing movie, and you'll walk us through it to kind of explain how the nutshell technique works. And I'm very excited for the movie that you're going to do, because it's the Bourne Identity, which is one of my favorite movies. I was telling Jill earlier that the trilogy is one of my, everyone has like their Christmas movies. Everyone's like, oh, Die Hard is a Christmas movie or whatever. In my family, the Bourne Identity is a Christmas movie. And so we generally watch the trilogy on Christmas. So I'm really excited to walk through it with you. I'm going to let Jill take the lead on this, and I'll probably ask some questions. If you guys have questions, please, in the chat. I'll try to work some in as we go if they're relevant, but we're going to let Jill cook a little bit and take us through this. So I'm going to share this with you, Jill. And why don't you start us out?
Great. Yeah. So this is my comedy form, right? So the Bourne Identity is structurally a comedy, meaning he changes, he learns, and he has a happy ending in the end. We'll look at real quick at a tragedy example so you can see that form. It's it's almost identical because we're dealing with the same principles here.
Mhm.
And so the first thing we're going to identify is the protagonist, right? It's Jason Bourne in The Bourne Identity. This is surprisingly not necessarily the easiest question. You know, I already mentioned the case of a secret protagonist, which it is not the norm. It's an exception. It's kind of advanced, but that does happen. Sometimes the person who has the most screen time, and I can think of a lot of movies that even that character's name is in the title, they are actually not the protagonist. They are not the one making the journey and the change, even though they may have a lot less screen time. They do have to be involved in some very critical moments in the plot. But so it's not necessarily the easiest answer, just so you know.
Yeah, it's interesting just to say that there are movies sometimes where you're like, it's almost like a point of view character, or like someone we're experiencing the movie. They're like a stand-in audience, but they're almost more there as a witness, kind of, than driving the story forward.
Exactly. And that's what makes it palatable. You know, if we, you know, in my book, I have an example of Crimes and Misdemeanors, which I believe you can't get on streaming, unfortunately, but it's a great example of a guy who gets away with murder. And any synopsis you'd see would probably refer to him as the protagonist, but there's something a little unpalatable about that, right? So we just need someone who, just like you said, is a stand-in for the audience in a way, who is going through a journey, that they're going through a journey that follows either the tragedy and comedy pattern, and as a lens in order to be able to enjoy the main character's journey of getting away with murder.
Gotcha. All right, so Bourne Identity, we got our protagonist. This one is pretty simple. He's the main character. He's the one with the big arc.
And his name is in the title. Not always,
his name is in all the titles for all the movies that come down the line as well.
We just did in my class last night Paddington, which fools a lot of people. Paddington is not the protagonist. Paddington is not the one who changes.
It's interesting because not to get hung up on the protagonist, but should be like the quickest one to talk about. But in some sense, Paddington is a great example because Paddington is fully realized, right? Sort of as a character, like he's already great, you know, like he's Paddington. And I think that's a thing, that if your character is already who they are, and that's just who they're going to be, then there's probably not going to be an arc going through this story.
He doesn't need to change. He's also childlike, and children are difficult to call protagonists. It's not impossible, but it's difficult, right? Because in the eyes of the audience, they're innocent. They don't really have flaws, which you're going to see are kind of central to the story.
Gotcha. All right, so we got our protagonist.
Okay.
What now? Yeah.
Yep. And so the next element we're going to look at is the setup one. We're going to look at it next, although surprisingly, because I'm sure all of your folks listening have been thinking about what their character wants and all these things. It is actually not the easiest element. It's actually probably the hardest element. This is the element that trips people up of the nutshell more than any element. And I'll try to explain as best I can. So actually, you know, we're going to look at it first. Typically, I tell people not to do it first. Typically, you want to establish your act breaks. That's what defines the story. What is the big event, the point of no return, that pushes us into the main part of the story? And what is the climax of the movie? Like, we should feel in our gut. We want lots of things. Nobody wants just one thing. We want lots of things. So as you're going to see, they're going to have to get this want in the point of no return. Plus, they're going to have to get to the opposite of this want in the crisis. That is not easy. That is why it's very hard, right? So Bourne Identity is actually a pretty straightforward example. Probably one of the reasons I chose it. There are a lot of examples, and I can give you some at some point if we want to come and talk more of some good examples where the setup want is not the obvious one at all. But once I tell you what it is, you'll see how it works so much better with the story. But for this example, I'll just go ahead and say his want, right? So it opens, the setup want we're going to find in the character's very first dialogue scene. And so, his first dialogue scene, right? He's a body floating in the ocean. The fishermen scoop him out, and the Italian, medic says, who are you? And his answer is, I don't know who I am, right? So his want is simply, as you might guess, is to figure out who he is, right? Very straightforward in this case. So the next thing I'm going to talk about excuse me, it's the point of no return. And yes, I'm familiar that there is a different script consultant who uses this term differently than I do. But this is what I call what happens at 25%. You would not believe how many movies it really does happen at exactly 25 minutes in. And I'm going to guess if you have people resistant to structure, they're probably resistant also to the idea that something has to happen at 25 minutes in. And let me, again, this doesn't come out of nowhere. Our attention span is about 25 minutes, right? Have you ever used the Pomodoro method, right? You set your timer for 25 minutes. If something big doesn't happen that pushes the story into an interesting direction by then, we're going to lose interest. So if your point of no return isn't until 35, you're risking that people are going to lose interest because we haven't gotten to the main part of the story. Which is what the second act is setting up. So the point of no return in the case of the Bourne Identity is where he goes to the safe deposit box, right? Safe deposit box reveals, he opens it up and it has a passport that says Jason Bourne. It has multiple passports, a gun, and cash. It actually happens a little early. It's at 14% in the running time, about 15 minutes. It's not too bad. That's not too crazy early. It's more late that's a big problem. And I definitely actually wouldn't do it earlier than 15 minutes. Because we need a little time to get to know the person, to see their struggle for the want. And so a couple of things about the point of no return. First of all, it is the only thing I'm going to be talking about that is external to the protagonist. It has to happen to them. The point of no return is never somebody decides to do something. Never. It is always something happens they didn't expect, and then they might decide to do something. But it's an external thing that if it hadn't happened, the movie we know as The Bourne Identity wouldn't have happened. If he didn't go open that safe deposit box, right? If he decided to do something else, or if he opened the safe deposit box and it didn't have a passports, gun, and cash, it just had a bunch of old watches in it, the movie known as Bourne Identity wouldn't be happening, right? That is the big event that pushes us into the main part of the story. It's setting up, so there's an element of fate here, right? He's not in control of it. This wasn't a decision. It happened to him. So we need that. We need this element of fate, this part outside of their control. I mentioned one of the things the method answers is why now? Why is your character doing this thing now, right? I'm sure you've heard that note before. Mm-hmm. This is the answer to why now. This thing happened to them. And that's why they're now going to do this, right?
Can it be ignored? I guess I have to say that when you say it can never be an internal thing, I'm like, oh, I'm not sure. I don't know if I believe you yet on that. So is this like, so if something is being presented, I understand that. And oftentimes we're saying like, this is the premise of the movie, like Armageddon or something, like there's an asteroid coming. Like that's the premise. This is all thing. But a lot of times there's a situation and someone's making a choice to do something in regards to that situation. But they can also choose sometimes to not do anything about it, to ignore it. So I'm curious, like in this structure, like, is the point of no return something that can be ignored, or is it something that's just like they have to deal with this and they don't really have a choice in taking them forward?
It's at a point where it really puts the story into motion. Like things are out of their control, even if there's a choice involved. That once they, so say something happens and then they make a choice, they're past a point of no return. They have made their life pre that event is different. They're going to be completely changed by that. And it's also, by the way, it's setting up the main part of the story, which is the second act. Which is where, it's what people think of as the story, is really the things that happen in the second act, right? So if this event hadn't happened, the movie wouldn't have happened. You might have another event that could make the movie happen, but we have to have that. to put him into motion, to disrupt him on the path that he was on, right? Like now he has to deal with this new piece of information that's going to change everything.
Gotcha. Okay, I think I get what you're saying. It's so interesting to learn how different people think about story.
I know.
And I think that's why I find it's fascinating, because I find like oftentimes you kind of get to the same point by a different path almost, because that's not how I think about it, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's just sort of almost an inverse of
I
how
know.
I think about it. So
it is a different way to think about it. And I'll tell you, I was on Meg LaFoe's podcast, The Screenwriting Life.
Yeah.
And I started to go into this, and she was very uncomfortable with that idea, right? That's not the way she thinks of story. She's very internal. And I was, encouraging her to think, well, what was the thing that made your character make that decision?
Yeah.
Right. Because again, there's an element of fate. There's an element of this thing happened that suddenly pushes our character in an unexpected story. They are not in control at this moment.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, because I feel like I would, in my mind, not to say it, but like I would kind of break it into two categories where, like, for me, there would be some things where there's like no choice scenarios almost, and choice scenario, or like have to deal with it scenarios and don't have to deal with it scenarios, kind of, where I feel like there are some scenarios where it's like there is a big choice kind of.
There can be a big choice involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's the one that I think of that. Oftentimes that's like the launching point. But then there are other movies, sure, where it's just like there is a situation that you kind of have to deal with.
More times it's in some ways, well, I don't know about more times. It's not like there isn't a choice about the box. It's just he opens the box and it changes everything. Yeah. Right. It changes everything, both in his perception about who he is. And also there's a plot element, right? That's when we see the security person saw that he came in there, and now the people after him know where he is. Yeah. Right. So that happened.
This is this is by completely sidetrack, but when you mentioned the security person, it reminded, there's actually a video online I saw where someone does the Bourne identity only from Bourne's experience. He cuts out everything else that's the CIA stuff and everything, and just says, like, this is what the Bourne was like if we only knew from Bourne's perspective. It was kind of interesting. Yeah. If people are interested in Bourne, they can check it out. All right, but okay, so point of no return. I jumped in on you there. Yeah.
Well, a real important thing with the point of no return is they don't just get what they want. Mm. They get it with a catch. This is so important. Sometimes people are they're using similar different methods that where their character gets a want, but they're forgetting they have to get a problem. You can't just give the person what they want. That kind of deflates all the conflict. So they're getting what they want. Very, very often, ironically, this one is actually not particularly ironic, but they get it with a catch. Mm-hmm. And the catch is, in the case of the Bourne identity, is it doesn't look good, right? It's not what is he expecting. These are the things that a dangerous criminal, like who has multiple passports with multiple identity, guns, and tons of cash in a safe deposit box, right? This is not the information he was expecting. And that's really what he's going to be struggling with, right? He was a dangerous criminal, right? We know before this, that's what he's struggling with, this old identity he had, and learning and understanding it, and then deciding to change. And so that's Act 2. And my drawing is not to scale, right? Act 2 is twice as long as our Act 1 and Act 3. But you'll notice I have almost no structure in Act 2. Except what happens it's very different than the other methods.
Feel free to say that you'll get to this later or ignore it. Yep. But the big thing when you mention Act 2 is I don't see a midpoint in there. Nope. So what's up with that? Why is there no midpoint?
And one of the popular questions people ask me, what do you think about the midpoint? And I always say, I think it's overrated. That there is, my whole premise is, if we set these things up in Act 1 and Act 2, if we set them up properly with the right glue, it's going to do all the heavy lifting of supporting Act 2, even though Act 2 is twice as long as you maintain conflict, as long as you continue to throw obstacles at the character. And I do talk about, in my classes, I actually do help folks go from just nutshell to developing a beat sheet in our classes. And I do have I use a method called the 8 sequence method, and which is, it's the linear part of it. I would say the difference with that and the beat sheet methods is it's not looking at beats, it's looking at sequences, right? So it's not just a moment. We're looking at what is the first 15 pages of Act 2 typically look like. And I always tell my students the stuff I have on my worksheet is 100% optional. I don't care if you follow my little 8 sequence chart or not, worksheet or not. And the midpoint, but I'll tell you how I define the midpoint, but it's not on here. Number one, it has nothing to do with the other elements. It has nothing to do with them, right? It's all of these, every single one of these elements is interdependent. If you change one, you're going to have to change several. It affects several things. So it's a very tight structure. And so if we find just a couple of these things, these small, it's not that many things. It's only 4 or 5 moments in time. And we connect them correctly, it provides all the tension you need to support your Act 2, even though I don't have any prescribed beats of structure. I will say, just since you asked about the midpoint, is that I define it a little bit differently than other people. And I want to say, once again, it's not part of the nutshell, but that I define, I think what most people call the midpoint is what I call what happens right after the midpoint, where stakes should be raised. I think that's what a lot of people call the midpoint. I call the midpoint is actually a moment that happens right before that. See our foot marks are showing that we're going to go down, down, down. This is our character's, our protagonist's emotional state of being, right? They're happiest at the top, they're saddest at the bottom. And so in Act 2, they're going to be, if it's a ha-ha comedy, we may be laughing. They are not laughing. They're going down, 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 down. And the way I like to define the midpoint is that it is a one little blip that goes up. So it's one little moment where we think, maybe this will work. Maybe they'll get away with the thing they were doing, right? It's a one moment that we have a little bit of relax from the tension. You know how sometimes even in a ha-ha comedy, Trains and Planes and Automobiles was one of those movies. It's supposed to be a silly comedy. I don't know about you. I've had enough travel, layover, cancel flight nightmares that I did not enjoy that movie. It was just the anxiety I had from it was too much, even though I knew it was supposed to be silly. I would argue it needed a stronger midpoint high, right? So it's that one moment where we think, maybe it could work. And then right after that, your stakes got to be raised and remind us, nope, it's not going to work. Not going to work. They thought for a second it would. So it's just a little bit of a release from that downward spiral. So that's how I define it. But again, I also tell my students that's not required. I know exceptions to that rule. And they're not part of the essential parts of it.
Gotcha. It's so funny because I feel like I'm experiencing something that it's probably very common for you, whereas like as you're talking in my head, I'm thinking about my current project. And I want to know if if everyone else watching this is also doing the same thing where you're thinking about like the script you're writing right now and saying like, does it fall into this? What is it doing? So yeah, let me know in the chat if you're doing story math in your head as Jill talks. But all right, so we have the catch. There's no midpoint. So instead,
we're going to the crisis. Yeah. And by the way, very often people do. This is like the missing link people find, the thing. It was like, oh, that's why the story wasn't working, right? That's the piece that was missing. Okay. So the crisis, as you can see here, is related directly to the want. So it has 2 requirements. It should be their absolute lowest place emotionally. And also it should be the direct opposite of the want. I have a checklist on my forms. And by the way, your viewers can download my forms for free on my website, jillchamberlain.com. And on it, the worksheet version has a little checklist over here. And it of all the things that need to be working in order for your nutshell to work. And with the crisis, it adds, is that really the lowest you could take your character? What if you said everything you said, plus they were in jail, plus they were suicidal, right? If this is a Frank Capra movie, guess what's happened at the 75% mark of every single Frank Capra movie? The protagonist is considering suicide. Now, that doesn't work with every movie, but that's a benchmark to keep in mind because that's kind of the lowest we can go, right? You feel so bad about it. And so, yeah, let's actually, this one, I want to actually look at a real quick clip, if we may. This is exactly at the crisis. I think it's right at an hour and 30, right where we want it to be.
All right, so I'm going to share this clip. Hopefully it works. Let's see.
What are you doing here?
The kids, I was worried.
We're gonna wake them up.
I don't want to know who I am anymore. I don't care. I don't want to know.
Come on, we'll talk.
Everything I found out, I want to forget.
It's okay.
I don't care who I am or what I did.
Yeah, well, it's yeah, so I love that because it's the exact opposite, right? I don't want to know who I am anymore. And it happens at an hour, a little earlier, the hour and 23 minutes, 70% of the running time. This is so important. So a lot of times, you know, people, they know that it's supposed to be a low moment. And even people who know my book still don't get it right because I'll give you examples. They'll have the want is a job, and at the crisis, they get fired. That's not the opposite. That's actually the same thing, because when you lose your job, what do you want? A job, right? This is actually it's more profound, actually. It's the thing that you loved, the thing that you wanted so much, you now despise. Right? So it's a real true reversal. This is where our characters really hit rock bottom. They've gone 180 from, you know, a singular focus about the want to realizing I've been completely disillusioned by my pursuit of the want. And that's where we want them to be, right? We want them to be devastated. Yeah. Okay. And I'll take us on next to the climatic choice. Sound good? Did you have a question? Was it okay?
No, well, it's interesting because I'm sorry, I'm lost in midpoint land. Because in my head, I'm like, this crisis is a reaction to what I probably would say the midpoint was that, like, he learns who he is and he doesn't like the answer. And so it was that moment forced him to then have this sort of realization, which I guess maybe you could say that was just like a continuation of what he learned in the post deposit box.
And it didn't have to be at the midpoint either.
Yeah.
It also didn't have to be right there, right? So it's you know, I think in my opinion, there's way too much emphasis on the midpoint. It just,
I'm not going to try to convert you.
If we want to understand the big picture, this is the big picture. And if you still want to do something important, you know, based on another method at midpoint,
sure.
I don't know, you probably can still do that. But it's not interrelated to these other things. As long as we're throwing obstacles at our protagonist, you know, he already had a bad sense of who he was at 25%, right? And it's not a good thing. And so just having that confirmed yes, it's more specific, but it's actually not that different. And it's not the same as getting to the point where, you know, where he really wants to be, I don't want to know who I am anymore.
Gotcha. All right. So we have a crisis.
Yep. And so now we have the climatic choice. And so this is the climax of the movie. The term I use the important term is climatic choice, because at the central to a true climax, your protagonist is actually making a difficult decision. And that's what's happening at the climatic choice. And so here's my bit on the climatic choice. So I'm sure you've heard this before, that a great ending is supposed to be inevitable yet unexpected, right? A great ending is supposed to be inevitable yet unexpected. That is a really tall order, by the way, but that is our goal, right? When they say ending, they really mean climax. A great climax should be inevitable yet unexpected. You know, once we see it, we never saw it coming. And then once we see it, we can't imagine the movie any other way. That's why it's the unexpected and it's also inevitable. So here's my best advice about how to find your inevitable yet unexpected climatic choice is right before the climax. Our characters at rock bottom in a comedy. You want to make sure they're between a rock and a hard place. It's really important. They have to be between two bad choices. It can't be a rock and a soft place, because if it's a rock and a soft place, then we know they're going to pick soft place. And if they don't pick soft place, we're going to be, why wouldn't you pick soft place? Right. Two bad choices. His choices are to turn himself in or to keep running and endanger all the people around him. Those are his choices as he sees them. So now, as we begin the third act, your protagonist has got to make a difficult choice. What are they going to choose? Are they going to choose rock? Are they going to choose hard place? No. They're going to choose, this is a very important vocabulary word I'm going to be teaching everybody. They're going to be choosing what I call banana. Banana, right? It's not a rock. It's not a hard place. It's not even a mineral, although there are a lot of minerals in bananas, I guess.
Potassium.
It's a third choice you didn't see coming. You didn't see it coming, although it didn't come out of nowhere. Sometimes there is something that happens in the second act that kind of helps give them, and it can be even closer to the climatic choice, that helps give them this light bulb moment of, I need to do something differently, right, to save the day. And so his climatic choice is to push Marie away, right? He pushes her away because he wants to protect her, to stop running and instead turn around and face his assassins. That's his climatic choice. Okay. And then we have our final step. So once our protagonist has done this, we don't necessarily have a happy ending yet. We don't really have closure. We've had our big explosive climax and the fallout from that, but that doesn't really give us closure. And that's why we need the final step. The final step is the very last scene of the movie that the protagonist is in. And I like to picture, sometimes you say 6 months later, right? You see that in movies a lot. They didn't do that so the final step in Bourne Identity is he finds Marie again, now that he thinks it's safe, although we find out in the sequel it wasn't. But here it's safe for the moment, right? And so, and notice, how do we know there was actually time has passed? Do you remember the visual cue of how we know it's 6 months later?
Well, I remember the plant in the bank bag. And her hair's different.
Her hair.
That's
her
it,
hair's different, right?
Right.
We saw before she had shaved her, cut her hair real short, and now she has pigtails. It's telling us it's 6 months later, right? So 6 months later, after all the falling action, now he's going to do that, and that's going to give the full closure we need. Okay. Now let me talk about I've left the most important element till now, which is the flaw. The flaw is the glue that holds everything together. And when I ask people about the flaw, sometimes people say something like he's violent. Well, they're going to have to go to the opposite in the third act, right? And he's still violent in the third act. He doesn't stop being violent. That's not the flaw we're looking for. People have multiple flaws, just like they have multiple wants. But the flaw that's essential to the story is that he reacts unconsciously, right? We see him at the inciting incident is actually in Zurich when he's sleeping on the park bench, right? And the police come up to him, and I counted, it's something like 8 seconds. He disarms both of them and has one of their guns and is like horrified and throws it down. He's reacting like the trained.
And also starts speaking German, just sort of without even realizing it, which is such a great moment when he has pauses for a second and he's like, yeah.
And so he's reacting like the trained assassin he was, right? And so the flaw, so this is how it's the glue, is that it's not I have it up here. It's not in time. It existed before the movie began. He was an assassin before he had amnesia, and it was somebody who reacted unconsciously. He was trained to react quickly. But it's going to be super important. And remember, I told you that we're yoking character development and plot together. And so this plot is not happening in a vacuum. This point of no return contains a catch that happens to be the perfect test of their flaw. Right? So he's someone who's struggling with this identity he doesn't want, this identity that suggests he's a dangerous criminal, but he's still reacting unconsciously all through Act 2. He's still doing that until this moment. And so then in the third act, they're finally good. I call these the flaw clouds. We have them on the catch, and then also the climatic choice in the final step are examples where they're going to move away from the flaw towards the strength, right? And his strength being to live life consciously. That's what he's doing. He's being very conscious about his choices. That's the big difference. That's what he changed in this one. And so I'm sure you've talked about the flaw before, right? It's a very important element of writing, but it happens in very specific plot moments. If I may give another example real quick, is that sometimes I talk a lot actually about the movie Tootsie, what screenwriting teacher doesn't. I put out a scenario of I'm going to take the movie Tootsie as we know it, but I'm going to make 2 changes. So it's, it's still about Michael Dorsey, out of work actor, gets a part on a soap. You're still thinking about the midpoint, aren't you? No, I'm just teasing. That's
no, I'm just wondering if how much of our audience has seen Tootsie. I don't know if it's how
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm wondering how much of the audience has seen Tootsie.
Oh, well, first of all, they must go see Tootsie. What's wrong with them? This is what, the AFI's second greatest comedy of all time. It's all screenwriting teachers talk about it. But the premise of it is a actor who, out of work actor, he's so desperate that he goes to an audition for a soap opera that's for a female part, and he pretends that he's a woman, and he gets the part on the soap. That's Tootsie, and he grows to hate it. And so at the end, he pulls off his prostheses and his fat suit, I'm sorry, that's my version. He pulls off his wig and and reveals that he's Dustin Hoffman. That's the real Tootsie. My version is called Fat Tootsie, right? So Fat Tootsie is this. We have the same movie, Michael Dorsey, out of work actor. He gets a part on the soap, but I'm going to change 2 things. One is that instead of it being a female character, it's a man, but it's supposed to be an obese man in the fictional soap opera world. And so he really wants the part. They want a real fat man. And so he's going to get a costumer friend, make him a fat suit, and a makeup artist make prostheses for him. He's going to get the part. And the other change is he'll tell the love interest he's gay. So she feels just as comfortable as she felt around his female persona. Very similar movie. We think it's funny in movies when men are dressed up as women. It could also be funny having a little guy like Dustin Hoffman pretending to be a big guy. He grows to hate it until live on the air, he's going to pull off his prostheses and his fat suit and reveal he's little Dustin Hoffman. But Fat Tootsie is a situation, not a story. 99% of writers are writing Fat Tootsie. They're putting their character in an arbitrary situation. It might be a clever sounding situation, but it has nothing to do with their flaw, nothing to do with their personality, right? So that's what's happened. This unexpected event of the point of no return happens to them, and unbeknownst to them, they're going to now face something in themselves. They don't know that, but that's what's going to happen. And what they're going to face is that flaw.
So I'm curious in terms of strength, because in some ways it seems like a lesson versus like people often would think of a strength as like an ability or something, like something that your character is very good at or something like. So is that different from kind of how you see the strength, the flaw to the strength?
It is. It's just the opposite. I mean, the opposite of a flaw. They're going to gain a strength they didn't have before.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's not like, I understand. So it's like gaining a strength, not like a sort of innate strength that the character possesses.
Yeah. It could have been an innate strength, but they have a flaw that is the opposite, right? They didn't learn that strength, or it wasn't in them. And so they need this. That's also why they're not a victim. Even if you have a character who's a victim in some senses, like that's another thing a lot of writers do, that your character's just getting pummeled by things, which we want, but we're pummeling them for a reason. We're pummeling them because we want them to face something in themselves. Even if what happens to them at the point of no return is horrible, there is something in there that it's going to get them to face, that if it's a comedy, they'll actually be better off in the end. They're actually going to have a happy ending, right? Because that this awful thing got them to face something in themselves that they their whole life they haven't dealt with.
Right. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's, and then I think in a second, I want to show the sort of the tragedy version of this so people can sort of see the difference. But I just want to say now that we've kind of go through it for the audience, if you have questions about this, of what we just went through, please ask in the chat now that we can all know what we're talking about, and we can ask Jill about it. But I would also just love to show, so I think just before we show the tragedy thing, we just sort of like look at the comedy shape as a point of comparison where, it goes down, things get bad, and then they get better, sort of in an overly simplistic version, versus this, the tragedy, where we're seeing a different shape, right?
Yeah. So we have the exact same elements. The difference is the triumph instead of a crisis down here, right? So with exact same elements, and then instead of moving away from the flaw, they're going to fail. So you still identify the strength. I think it's important to identify how they could have had a happy ending had they changed. But because they failed to, right? So they continued their flawed ways. So yeah, my example, is of the social network. Mark Zuckerberg, he wants to get into a final club. He's in a physical final club. He didn't actually get admitted to it, right? He's in a physical, so he gets his want ironically. He's in a final club where that's where he gets the inspiration. The catch is it's similar to the Winklevosses. So now our steps are going up, 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 right? A tragedy is up, up, up. And that's something people sometimes don't understand about a tragedy. It's not completely down, 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 down. That's too much. They need to, and again, I'm not using the term like the colloquial term of something being tragic. I'm talking very specifically about the Aristotelian version of this, where we're talking about a character who needed to change, right? If Mark Zuckerberg had changed from hubris to humility, he might have had a happy ending, an emotionally happy ending. He still has $1 billion, but he emotionally is always going to be lacking because of this journey. And so so things are going up, up, up. And I'm extrapolating. I mean, obviously things are up and down, but we're generally going up. And then until at the 75% mark, they're at the highest point of achievement, but it's also related to the want, right? He wanted to get into a final club. Well, now he has his own final club with a million people have signed up for Facebook, and he's the CEO of it, right? The ultimate manifestation of the want to be in a final club.
Which, people who don't know, the final club is like an exclusive organization, like a super exclusive frat at Harvard. And it's like where the most prestigious and like coolest, best people who are primed for success are going to join. And so he sort of creates his own version of it with the Facebook, where he's the CEO. He's the head of the biggest, coolest club in the world.
In the world at the time. Yeah. Yeah. And then the climatic choice, similarly should feel climatic, right? It should feel that. And it should be an opportunity that they could have changed, right? Because ideally we want to feel when they make that climatic choice, like this is what makes a tragedy satisfying. They're tricky, but they can be very satisfying if they're done well. And in my opinion, the thing that's lacking that is most important to make it done well is that when they make the choice, we go, oh, no, why'd you do that? Like, oh, you had everything. You had everything. All you had to do was make this little change, but he can't do it. And so he worsens the flaw instead of moving towards the strength by cheating his best friend in the New Deal. Same thing with the final step. He's sending his ex a friend request and hitting refresh again and again, because his hubris is telling him she would still want to be my friend, right? When it's pretty obvious to us she would not. But his hubris can't accept that, and is hitting that again and again. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because in terms of like a tragedy, people think of like, oh, like they die in the end or something. Whereas like the tragedy is that he's like one of the richest people in the world, so it's
unhappy. Yeah. The tragedy is the richest person in the world, and he's still profoundly, he's profoundly lacking.
Yeah. But it's like, in some ways they can still win in some ways and lose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, they should because in a comedy, it's actually, you realize you don't want the thing you thought you wanted,
Right.
right? That's not what was so important. And that you give that up in order to open yourself up to the positive change that you needed, and will give you a happy ending that's emotionally happy, but might be financially much more modest, or even, opposed to the idea of that. And then a tragedy, again, being the opposite, that they make that wrong choice, that we're like, oh, why'd you do that? You could have saved face by doing something, and you would have made that emotional change you needed to be a whole person. Yeah.
Cool. I want to get a few questions from the audience. Drew was wondering if this can be applied to a dual protagonist story.
Yeah, so it would be, but I will tell you, only one of them is the real protagonist. This is a tool for the writer. So it works the same thing with an ensemble picture. If you have an ensemble picture where we have 8 different people we're following for maybe close to the same amount of time, and you can't tell who the protagonist is, that's fine. The audience can be confused. It's your tool to know one of them is the true protagonist. So, and I say this, it'll just make your life easy to know you only have to figure out for one of them those profound kind of changes, and make sure those nutshell elements are in there. You could still have an arc for the other character, but you only nutshell one character. Believe me, don't even try. But sometimes people change. I have to see that a lot. People come in character, they bring one character, and then they have to, they'll go back and forth until they kind of decide who is having the more profound journey, who is making that climatic choice. Those are among the things we look at to determine that. But good question.
Another question. I think this is this was back to going from flaw to strength. How about a more implicit change? Let's say going from a prejudice view to an acceptance at the end of the arc. Is that something that you could see kind of working in a nutshell technique?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to say it more crude way, but like racist to, loving of all people, right? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And you could see that there are movies like, I don't know, American History X, or maybe could be one of those that just popped in my head.
And I did want to add about the flaw. It should, the way I'm using the word flaw is it should be an internal lacking that they have the ability to change. So, for example, mental illness is not a flaw. You're not in control of that. Right. Now, being stubborn and refusing to take your medication could be a flaw, right? And similarly, I don't consider alcoholism a flaw. We want to dig deeper. They're different alcoholics, right? And so what is the thing that you are, the flaw in you that has you trapped using alcohol as a way to deal with how you're lacking?
Gotcha. Marky wants to know, what are your thoughts of introducing the main protagonist around the point of no return? Is that someone, do we need to meet them significantly earlier in order to make this technique work?
We don't have to. Typically, they're going to be introduced in the beginning, in the first 10 pages, the first sequence. But there are exceptions. Those tend to be, though, more. I see that more in secret protagonist movie, where we've been following this one character we think is the protagonist, but they're a bad person who's going to do bad things and not suffer for it. And then somebody comes along around 24 minutes with a want that they immediately get in a point of no return that involves that person. And there's some other exceptions like that.
Gavin, having read your book, what is something, maybe a realization after publishing that isn't in the book? Oh, that's fascinating. That's like my always fear as a writer. As soon as you hit send or something, then you have oh wait, I should have included. I mean, is there another edition coming or something with something you realized since?
Well, yeah, there's not another edition yet. I would love to do a TV in a nutshell, since I do, and I should admit it works for television episodes. And side note, it's per episode. It's not a season arc. We're looking at each episode has a point of no return, has a climax. That's what we're looking at. The only thing I can think of right now is I wish I described the want. The want has been the hardest part to explain to people. And in the book, I even it's the one element. I actually have 2 chapters for that reason, because I knew it was going to be difficult to explain. And I talk about how in some movies, you're better off what I call it a throwaway want. And I kind of regret the wording of saying a throwaway want. It's more that it comes in a throwaway line. An excellent example of this is, and I actually talk about this example in the book, is the Groundhog Day. Right? So the big event, right, is he wakes up and it's the same day twice. Well, what could he have wanted that he got? If you look at that first scene, he has some obvious want. His obvious want is he talks about how there's a big network scoping him, has been trying to recruit him. That's his big want. He doesn't get that want. I think he wants women in general to worship him, and maybe Andy McDowell in particular. He gets that later, but not in the point of no. You have to get it at the point of no return. And what really drove the point home for me is when I was watching the movie and looking at 3 different versions of the script you can see, and the setup want is actually not in any of the movies. They did not have. It's not in any of the script versions you see. They did not have the benefit of me on the set to say you're missing the want. But someone realized, even Phil, this horrible person, doesn't deserve to be a victim of the universe playing this mean trick on him, right? He actually asked for it. He says, it's a little throwaway line. He says the substitute weatherman is kind of sucking up to him because he wants more time. He says, spend another night there. I'll be happy to cover for you. And his response is, please, like I want to spend another second in Puxatawny. So his want is to spend no more than 24 hours in Puxatawny. He gets his want when he wakes up and it's the second day.
Gets it over and over again.
But the catch is he's going to do it over and over. So see how profound that is?
Yeah.
They found that very late in the process, obviously. And so that's why I encourage people to put the want aside. I know it's hard because everyone focuses on what my character wants. You got to find what is the big event that's going to challenge my character. And then you ask yourself, what did they get that they wanted? Or what could they have gotten? And so sometimes it's almost, and Juno's another example I talk in the book, where it's just a little throwaway line. And so I didn't mean to say it was a throwaway want. It actually relates deeply to his character. It's right. He's a jerk who thinks Puxatawny's so miserable, he can only stand spending a day there. And the universe says, well, you're such a jerk, and you're so miserable. We're going to grant you your wish, but you're going to have to spend the same day over and over till you get it right. So it relates, but it does sound a little bit, it sounds a little too flippant, and I don't mean it to be, but I try to loosen people up to stop being attached to the want. Because if they had been attached to the want of him getting a network job, it'd be a totally different movie. Right. Yeah. And I'm not saying he doesn't want that. He says he wants that. I believe him. He wants that. It's just not the want that sets up the story.
Gotcha. This is something I was wondering. Mia, Egan, or Moopsie, however you want to be referred to as, would this technique work for a horror thriller type of script? Absolutely.
Absolutely. Horror can be a little trickier, for sure, because we do see, very often it seems like most of the characters die or whatever. And I would say the better horror movies still find a way that we have a protagonist, right, who should have learned better and who has the tragic ending, or there's a character who's triumphant. But absolutely it can. It really, anytime you want to ensure you're telling a story and not just presenting a situation, right, not just presenting a series of events, it's a great tool.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you, now that we sort of have an understanding of what it is, just kind of more from the writer kind of actually using this perspective, I want to know how you start with this, because oftentimes a movie or a pilot can start with so many different things. You have an idea for a scene, a line of dialogue, a character, you're just sort of, you have some little thing that you build from. So how do you sort of use this as a process of developing your story, your structure? Are there certain elements in the nutshell technique that you need to start with? Can you start with from anything? How do you get started using it?
Yeah, so I think and there are a couple different ways this could go, but most of the time we start with a premise, right? What if somebody woke up and it was the same day as the day yesterday? When you have a strong premise like that, that points you to a nice, strong point of no return. Matter of fact, I don't even need a character. I could start, start with that. I could start with trying to put Rita, the love interest, Andy McDowell, in it, and then realize, she doesn't have the right flaw, So starting with that, I think, is really strong. If you start with a character, I'm actually not a fan of doing character profiles, because I think people they spend too much time thinking about too many details that can often get in the way of finding a good story. And I mean, I can address biopics are a little, obviously you have to start with a person, but even with biopics, my philosophy is Wikipedia it and be done. Like, you don't want too many facts. Those pesky facts are going to get in the way. One of my clients is David Gleason, who wrote the movie Tolkien. And his philosophy is he writes the story first, and then he does research. He doesn't even want to be, it's like, what is a snapshot, of just knowing the most basic history of this person that is interesting to me, that sounds like a story, right? Because you got to get to the story part of it. And then I can fill in the details later. So it's great if you start with a premise. And if you're starting with a character, say, because it's a biopic, and I should warn people, biopics are the hardest kind. They're absolutely the hardest kind of the story, because you got those pesky facts you have to deal with, right? And that
there isn't inherently a story there. Perhaps there's just a life. So you have to.
Life is inherently a situation. Life is inherently as a situation, not a story. We're the ones who put meaning onto it.
Yeah.
Inherently it doesn't have one. And so, but if you are starting with that, you really you've got to look for those. I say look for the act breaks in particular. What's a big event that I think could set up a period of their life that's where they're dealing with a change, and then what's a good climax. And sometimes you can't find that. Sometimes that's why we see a lot of secret protagonists in biopics, or not a lot, but you see it a fair amount, because somebody was a good person and died an unfair death, and it had they didn't contribute in any way. They're not going to make a great protagonist. You may have to tell their story through somebody else's lens. So I also say jump around, I should say. So you don't have to do any of these things. It's kind of like, I know I have this great closing scene in mind. Maybe start with the final step, and pencil in the flaw, but be open that maybe, I tell people, keep digging. We keep digging with the flaw. Sometimes the thing you thought was the flaw, it's a different one will work better, or nuanced, something slightly different works better. So just kind of jump to what you think I know, with the exception of the want. If you think you know the want, that's probably not going to be the right want. It might be, but just don't get locked into it.
It's funny. You touched on a lot of things in that answer, but one thing I just wanted to pick up on is what I agree with is the character bio thing. Because I just feel like as a writer, there's always this temptation for like the details that you're really interested in, but like really have nothing to do with your story. And like a rule of thumb that I like to use in terms of that is if it's not affecting the story moving forward, it's really not relevant at all.
Exactly.
Like, there's only what we see, only what the character does in the movie.
Exactly.
Is going to.
And that's the danger with the profiles, that sometimes people want to get those, this fiction, it could be this fictional fact of this character, and they get distracted about that, and it keeps them from being open to, to me, the character development is really 90% of it is in the flaw strength, and the rest is, the specifics of what was the event that got the person to start to have to change from that, right? That's going to be different for different flaws. Someone could have the exact same flaw, but their story is going to be different, because, what is the specific event that would get that person to have to deal with it?
All right. So it's kind of interesting in this, because I don't know if you're familiar with the plotter versus pantser dynamic. Right. So plotters are people who are very into outlining before they write, and pantsers write and figure out the structure as they go. I sort of fall in the middle where I figure out shape and then I'm writing, but then oftentimes though, for me, a first draft is a discovery process. So how does it, I mean, when do you use this? Like in some sense, like, is this something you have to figure out before you write the first draft, or can you be sort of doing it in tandem and having it evolve as you're kind of writing your vomit draft or your first draft and sort of actually figuring out what your story is?
So for me, I definitely do it beforehand, and I encourage people to figure out the nutshell beforehand. You may, as you write it, discover things that make you change it and realize, oh, that's actually not the flaw. It's really about this, or that's not a great point of no return. That I need to find one, that's different. But I work differently than a lot of people, in all my classes and with my clients, I make them fill out the form. We start with the form because it's the reason I like it is because we are looking at these 8 story elements, and it is very easy, or relatively easy, to fix problems, to see, well, your climatic choice isn't a banana. Let's stop right now and find you a banana. That kind of thing. And so, but sometimes the writing, and so I actually recommend doing a beat sheet and then doing a script. And it's more in the beat sheet process that very often it helps inform the nutshell and make you realize, oh, it's about this. I know people like to do vomit drafts and are happy to throw it out. I am not one of those people. And I would be very frustrated if I ended up with a vomit draft and realized I had to throw the whole thing out. So the idea is also that this saves you a lot of time and fewer drafts because we're thinking about the story ahead of time. That doesn't mean we can't change our mind about the nutshell elements later.
Drew had a question. I was going to ask this as well, because in terms of like what terms you did use and didn't use, how does theme fit into the nutshell technique? Since a character's flaw likely connects to a bigger idea the film is exploring, is flaw and strength the same as theme and anti-theme?
Yeah, it's very much connected. I like to think of theme as a more universal version of the specifics of the flaw, my Tootsie example, is about a man who doesn't respect women, who discovers from literally walking in women's shoes how difficult it is to be a woman and to respect them. That was kind of a clumsy theme statement, but that flaw of lack of respect for women, but made to be a little bit more universal to the story. So it's very related to that.
Christian was saying, is it fair to say the catch reveals the flaw? Putting this up. Is that, or it tests it?
It tests it. It's not, I wouldn't say that. It may in some instances be the first time you kind of are aware of it. You may not be aware of it at all. The character is typically not aware of it, right? They have no idea they're being tested on their flaw. But typically I tell people we should be seeing signs of it from page 1 of the flaw. It's just because they have no idea they're being tested. They have no idea, right? They just think this thing happened to me and it's inconvenient and it's making my life difficult when I thought things were going to be easy when I got my want, and it's causing problems for me. And that's why it's testing it, because they don't even realize that it's a problem. So I think it's good to see signs of it. It doesn't have to be huge, blatant ones, but I think you should see signs of it from the beginning.
That brings another question I was wondering. In terms of signs and awareness, how subtle or obvious do you think these elements should be in the script? Are people saying this is your problem, or like, oh, I want this, or I have a big choice to make, like how obvious or subtle do you find it?
That's kind of up to you. I love the Bourne identity because for a lot of reasons, but because it's one movie that is very clear about the opposite of the want. And I tell, he literally says, I wish I'd never found this out. And people miss it. a lot of times if you don't do that. And I'll go to Groundhog Day is got kind of a beautiful one that I think nobody gets, which is because it's not spoken. So the want was to only spend 24 hours in Puxatawny. The crisis is actually starts positive. It's he and Rita he's told her what's happening, and they've had this amazing day together, like genuine, and they've enjoyed it. And she's starting to fall asleep on his bed. And he says, you know what the worst part is tomorrow you're going to think I'm a jerk again. I really wish they'd been on the nose and said, you know, what it is that I wish this day would last forever. Like, how beautiful is that irony of the man trapped in a day he's trying to get out of, who wishes this day would go forever. And I don't think people get that, right? And I think that's a great moment that was missed. One of the only things I think that was missed by that movie. It's kind of up to you. It's I'll give you another example. There's a showrunner who I've worked with who he told me that he found it helpful. You know, he loves the nutshell technique. He used it in developing the script, but he found it helpful in the notes process that, you know, they were getting notes back that people don't understand this character. We don't get this character. And he realized, oh, like the flaw isn't coming out. And so they actually added in post, you know, where it's somebody's back and, you know, they added it. Yeah, they actually, they ADR'd in a line where someone said, you know what your problem is? I mean, they literally did that. You know what your problem is. And then people loved it. And it's similar, they had it with the want. It's like, we don't understand why the mother's so cranky and mean to everybody. And it's like, I didn't get her want in, you know?
Yeah. It's so funny. The back of the head ADR is such a thing where it's like, once you see it, it's, I understand why it's used there, but like, it just bugs the heck out of me sometimes. Because I'm just like watching.
Well, don't wait till you do the post then.
I know. And I'm like watching the jaw muscles and I'm like, the jaw muscles not moving. No one's talking. But, it's also interesting that because it's one of those things where it doesn't matter kind of that the jaw muscles aren't moving. Like there are so many times where you'll have like mistakes in movies or TV that like they don't matter if people are understanding the character and the story, like that's what you're there for. And because the whole thing is an exercise in suspension of disbelief anyways, like none of this is actually really happening. So if you're with the story, you know, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but the want and flaw are so important that if people aren't getting, you know, like you said, it made all the difference that people were like, didn't understand the characters, why they were doing what they were doing. And he realized, you know, I'll just find a scene where his back is to the camera and ADR him saying something and everybody got it.
No, that's just one of my
I hear you. Yeah.
Personal, and we all have our little things that I see there are some questions that are about very like specific scenarios in the chat. I'm not going to get into those just because you have to like dig in, and that's kind of writing a whole thing right there. But just quickly, Kim, you do, because you asked, you do have a TV pilot version of this, correct? That is on.
I'll tell you, there's only one significant difference. I will say it's a lot harder to nutshell television because, right, you're dealing with typically you have so many different characters and storylines and figuring out which one. But the principle's the same thing as when we were talking about ensemble or a dual protagonist. Audience doesn't need to know. You can decide who is the protagonist, who is, you know, it's typically going to be that A story. But that's up to you. The only significant difference I know of between using the nutshell for feature film and for episodic is the timing of the point of no return. That's literally the only difference I've seen. And where it, you know, typically in a feature, I told you, you're really asking for it if you don't have it happen by 25 pages. In pilots, just because the timing is so crammed, I have seen the point of no return as early as 8% in the running time to as late as 50% in the running time, which would be, of course, crazy late to put that in a feature film. That would be crazy to have, like, make us wait for an hour for something to happen. But, you know, if we're talking about a 50-minute, 1-hour pilot, 25 minutes is 50%. And you're setting up, particularly in the pilot, you're setting up not just that episode, but you're setting up a whole series, right? So sometimes you do need to have a later one, but otherwise the principles are exactly the same.
One thing I'd also say about pilots is that I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is they actually have that at the end of the pilot. And so like the whole thing is leading up to this big thing that happens at the end. And then in episode 2, we're in a whole new world. Whereas like your pilot needs to be in that world. So like you need to have that moment up early so that we can actually see the characters in this new world, which is what the show is going to be moving forward.
Yeah, and I should add, actually, and the final step is a little different too, in that we need the thing that gives us legs into the next show, right? So there might be something, and sometimes that means the final step is a little let definitively closure and a little bit less definitively positive or negative, or it is like acts like a feature final step, but maybe you have something else illustrating that they're showing us, oh, it's not over just because he said it was over. Yeah. It's not really over.
It's a challenge because, yeah, I mean, TV, that's more where I come from. And it's like you have to have closure and a launch kind of in a very short period of time.
It's impressive, actually.
Before we go, just a couple quick questions. In your work as a script consultant, I'm kind of curious what kind of notes you find yourself giving most to your clients.
So, I don't know how other script consultants work, really. I just know how I work. And I'm working on both a micro and a macro level. So I'm marking up as I go with little things, a gazillion little things, depending on how experienced the writer is. But I'm also looking big picture. I have people set it with a nutshell form, even if they're brand new. I want to know what you think it is. And I, because I consider myself more of a story structure expert, that's where I'm, you shouldn't come to me if you just want, sometimes people just want a quick read. I'm like, I'm not a good person to call for that. You're probably not going to want to pay what I charge for it. And then it's not going to be a quick read. It's going to be, I'm going to be looking to make sure you have the strongest possible structure. And I'm going to have very specific suggestions for you because I want to see you bring it up to another level. And typically I can see exactly what, where you were trying to go and what to change. And I don't do written notes. I do margin notes. So you get your script back with my notes, little notes and a little teeny overview. But I do a big part of the consultation is I talk with you for an hour and a half. We go through the script and then, because I don't know what you were going for it sometimes, or you were trying something, it's not working and I don't know what it is. And so, I see my job as I don't ever want to impose my view. I want to find out what is the story you want to tell and help you tell it the best. So sometimes that requires, I have to talk to you because I don't know what you're going for. And then I understand, oh, that's what you were trying to do. Well, then this is how I think you should structure it. That kind of thing.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much. Is there any final word? I like to oftentimes people have, you have an audience of screenwriters, aspiring screenwriters here, looking to apply their trade and improve and grow their careers. What would you leave them with?
Well, I don't know if this is, well, what I would suggest is if they're interested in the nutshell technique is to watch for these things, that it really helps to nutshell kind of everything you see. And again, don't focus on the want, focus on those act breaks. And even if you don't embrace my method, I think everyone should focus on the act breaks. Those are, I tell people that sometimes I sign a movie every week in my classes, and sometimes my students think too hard. And I for certain movies, I'll say, if you should turn to your spouse, and if you ask them, what was the big event that changed everything? And what was the climax of this movie? They're going to get it. You might be trying to intellectualize and answer all my things, but we should feel those two moments in our gut. Everybody, every movie, we should feel those two moments. What is the big event that pushes our protagonist into the story, the real part of the story? And what is their climatic choice, right? What is the climax? And until and the reason I focus on this and I suggest kind of studying it is I strongly believe you don't know your story until you know those two moments, right? There are 1,000 places, and that's one of the issues I have with pantsing a little bit, is because there are 1,000 places to start a story. There's really one right one, when you found the right one. And so if you don't know your climax, you don't really know your story. You just have a premise. And so you're free to do a vomit draft if that helps you find it. But this is a way to kind of force you to start thinking about those elements. I don't know if that was too self-serving an answer, or if I was supposed to say something more inspirational.
Yeah, you can
didn't have anything ready.
Throw a tag on it. Throw something inspirational at the end.
Something inspirational on it. I can give you something inspirational.
Yeah.
Okay, a little bit. I don't know. It's also self-serving and inspirational. Just that it's hard. Structure is hard. One of my clients his movies have made $1.5 billion at the box office. He writes comedy. And so he's, in a very rare class. He's obviously very talented. But he discovered my book. He came in, he filled out his form. He was all excited. And I was like, your climax is not climatic, and nor is it a banana. We're going to stop. We're going to figure it out. So I'm just saying that even, don't think that people get it right on the first draft, or that people figure out the structures immediately, or anything like that. Give yourself some grace there, that it's difficult for people at all levels.
Awesome. Yeah. Jill, one more time, do you want to mention your website where people can learn more and get your worksheets?
Sure. Yeah. JillChamberlain.com is where I have information about my consulting. You can get my free worksheets. I have a screenwriting school I started 19 years ago. It's called the screenplayworkshop.org, where I have ongoing classes where in 10 weeks people write a script, or they write either a feature or a TV pilot. And it's all levels, lots of beginners. And I also have people who've won Emmys who take that class. Those are my websites. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jill, I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. I want to thank the audience for showing up and sticking with us and asking great questions along the way. I will just quickly drop again. If you want to do some screenwriting with me next Wednesday, Let's Write Scripts every Wednesday at 1 p.m. on this YouTube channel. And there's a link below at arcstudiopro.com/events. It's really fun. Speaking of the Pomodoro method, we do some 25-minute writing sprints. Yeah, that is it for tonight. I will just say happy writing, everyone. Be kind to yourselves. And until next time, just keep writing. Good night, everyone.